Večeras je sa nama Pol Kurion. Radio je više godina kao konsultant u humanitarnim organizacijama, a sada je operativni direktor finansijsko-tehnološkog startupa Disperse. Sa nama je večeras, dakle, zbog toga što odnedavno učestvuje u kreiranju eksperimentalnog projekta univerzalnog osnovnog dohotka u Srbiji, radeći u okviru UN razvojnog programa zajedno sa lokalnim istraživačima. S obzirom da smo mi u stvari želeli da u okviru ovog programa zaista se bavimo pitanjima koje prevazilaze samo prostorne politike, činilo nam se da je dragocena prilika da kroz prikaz jednog praktičnog eksperimenta u najavi, kakav je ovaj večeras koji će biti predstavljen, dakle, otvorimo diskusiju o modelu univerzalnog osnovnog dohotka u lokalnom kontekstu. Kod nas i u regionu je ova tema uglavnom bila predmet kritičkih razmatranja na levici u tekstovima koji su upozoravali, na prateće mere koje eventualno idu uz uvođenje univerzalnog osnovnog dohotka i koje onda u velikoj meri određuju i njegov učinak. Verujemo da će večeras biti otvorena i ta pitanja, ali i neka druga, i veliko hvala Polu što u stvari prvi put predstavlja ovaj svoj predlog, dakle, i otvara ga za diskusiju, možda i kritiku, ali u svakom slučaju nekako mislimo da je važno da u ovome učestvujemo svi zajednički. Eto, hvala. Poli.
Hvala. Dobro večer svima. Izvini, moj srpski je loše i pričam na engleskom. Hands up who here knows what universal basic income is. Okay, that's good. Hands up who doesn't know what universal basic income is. Okay, it's nothing to be ashamed of. I'm going to talk this evening about an experiment that I designed earlier this year in universal basic income. And I did this work with the UN Development Program. And at the moment, the experiment is not proceeding. So everything is frozen because it's the UN and things move very slowly. But also because politically, universal basic income is a very complicated policy tool. And even implementing an experiment in basic income is very, very difficult. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a quick overview of universal basic income. I'm going to talk about the research that we did and the experiment design. I'm then going to talk about some of the issues around universal basic income. And then I'd like everyone to feel free to ask questions. And there are no stupid questions. Everything is open. What I want is to start encouraging people to start talking about basic income. Not because I love basic income, but because I think Serbia needs more space for this kind of policy debate. I'm sure most of you will know that in the mainstream, there's very little space for trying out new policies, for policy experiments, for exploring what the possibilities might be for the future of Serbia. And one of the things that I'd like to do is to help to create that space. I've been living in Serbia for a few years now. That's why my Serbian is so good. I feel like this is part of my contribution, hopefully, towards that wider discussion. So, building a path to universal basic income in Serbia. Basic income, which I will refer to as UBI from now on, it's experienced a real surge in visibility over the last few years. In a number of different countries, there have been a range of pilots tried or proposed. There's popular support for the idea growing, increasingly in different countries when they take opinion polls and surveys. Larger numbers of people now are interested in exploring the idea. They think it might be a good way forward. The reason for this is relatively simple, I think. Since the financial crisis, a lot of people have become obviously disillusioned with the existing systems that we have, and particularly around social welfare. There are a few crisis points that people have identified. So in areas like pensions, in areas like child protection, and in areas like poverty reduction, people are looking for new ideas. And although universal basic income is not a new idea, people have picked up on it and have thought maybe there's something here that we should explore. Now, one of the things that's strange about basic income, about UBI, is it's very simple to describe in simple language. And this is the definition that's given by the Basic Income Earth Network at the top. Basic income is a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without any means test or work requirement. So relatively simple elements there. The key ones really are the four that are identified. Unconditional. You don't have to meet any requirements in order to receive it. You don't have to take any tests. You don't have to be, the state doesn't have to say you're eligible. Everybody is eligible. There's a question around who is everybody. Universal means it's for everyone. Everybody. Young, old, rich, poor, male, female, it doesn't matter. Everybody receives it. Basic. Basic refers to the amount of income. And basic normally is defined as enough to live on, to meet your basic needs. Basic needs such as food, shelter, often utilities. So enough that if you didn't have anything else, you would still be able to survive with some dignity. And finally, it's income. And this is very important because a lot of people don't understand this part. It's income. So the state treats it as income. It is taxed as income. And that becomes very important in terms of building up basic income in the budget, in the state budget. It also becomes very important when you think about how people perceive it when they receive it. If any of you have ever received any social protection payments, then you'll recognize that it feels different to receiving a salary from a job. Somehow there's less dignity attached towards in society. If you receive unemployment, for example. When I was younger, I had unemployment benefits in the UK, and it felt very different. I had to go to the unemployment office, I had to sign on every week, I had to receive the benefit. It felt like charity rather than something that I was owed. Whereas income is something that you feel you've deserved. And again, we'll come to the question about what that means to deserve a basic income. Now, the challenge is, although it's very simple to define in simple terms, it's very difficult to define in policy terms. And if we take each of those elements that I just described and go through them, you can see that there are some very difficult questions that need to be answered before you could implement basic income. So universal. It's to everybody, but who is everybody? Does it include everybody who's living in the country? Does it just include citizens? Does it include everybody, whether they're young or old? Or should somebody receive it on behalf of children? So, for example, a 5-year-old. Should a 5-year-old receive basic income? And if so, how should they receive it? They probably don't have a bank account. They're obviously not old enough to be able to understand what the money is for. So from a policy point of view, that's a question that needs answering. Basic. So I talked about the fact that basic income is supposed to be enough to survive on. But who decides what is enough to survive on? How do you measure what is enough to survive on in monetary terms? Is it enough to do what's called a partial basic income, where it meets some of the needs but not all of the needs? Does a universal basic income cut out other aspects of support? So, for example, some people have proposed the idea of universal basic services rather than basic income, so that all services by the state should be universal and should be free. So there are different ways of approaching this question that don't necessarily involve this idea of basic. And then income. So how do you pay it out? Now, obviously in Serbia, there's a banking infrastructure, there's a mobile phone network, but not everybody has a bank account. Not everybody has a mobile phone. And obviously in other countries around the world, there's lots of people who don't have bank accounts, lots of people who don't have access to mobile phones. So how would they receive the basic income? Would someone drive up to their house and just hand them a bag of cash? There's a very practical question there. I mentioned before that it's treated as income, so it's taxed. So how do you tax it? If your country doesn't have a strong taxation system or a strong tax office, you won't be able to tax that income back in the case of people who are over the income bracket. So there are questions there, and one of the most important questions around that income is, does the income replace all other forms of social protection? Some people on the right wing believe that if you implement basic income, you should take away all the other state protection. So take away pension, take away child protection, take away disability, take away unemployment benefit. And personally, I find that unacceptable, but one of the arguments is that if you give everybody enough of an income, they can just use the market to access everything they need. So obviously, I think most people here would have a problem with that. These questions have only become important because basic income has become more visible. Previously, basic income was just a theoretical mechanism. Nobody had really tried it out until the second half of the 20th century, and even the experiments that had been done had not been known about very widely. So now, as the visibility has increased, these questions have become more important. And it's important to answer those questions because obviously you need to be able to make a decision, right? Is it worth trying basic income? Is the potential cost of basic income worth what the impact will be? And in order to measure that, obviously you have to understand what the impact is. Now, one of the reasons for doing a policy experiment, for doing an experiment with basic income, is to try to measure that impact. Because we could sit at our desk all day and say, okay, well, how will it affect people's health? How will it affect people's views on work? How will it affect people's sense of dignity? But you can't really tell that. You need to actually test it to see how people respond to it. And once you do that, then you can start to measure whether it's worth trying it on a larger scale. So the question then is, well, what are you testing? What is the potential impact of basic income? And a number of the experiments that have been carried out have measured different aspects of basic income. And these are some of the ones that have come out in terms of, okay, if we implement basic income, how might people experience it? So some of the things that have been found in other experiments or in some of the simulations, one, it can reduce poverty and potentially reduce inequality. That's really obvious. If you give everybody enough to live on, they're not poor anymore. They're poor in other ways, but in the most critical way, they have enough to survive on. Safeguard against automation. So one of the arguments is that as robots begin to take over a lot more jobs, a lot of people are going to be moving into unemployment with very few options to take new jobs. And the idea is that basic income could potentially help to smooth over that transition. In fact, take us into a new place where people don't have to work for money because automated industries are doing all the work. There's a huge set of questions in there. Third, enable more entrepreneurs. One of the reasons why people don't start new businesses is because of the risk involved. So the idea is, if you have enough income to live on, it's not so much of a risk to start a business. More people will start businesses. This has been demonstrated in experiments, that people are more prepared to start their own businesses when they receive a basic income. 4, to facilitate finishing education. Again, for a lot of people, particularly from poorer families, they leave education early because they need to work. They need to support their family or contribute to their family income. If everyone was receiving a basic income, that pressure goes away and people are more free to finish their education to the level that they want to. 5, to value unpaid work. So it's well known that a huge amount of work in the world is not paid for. So you think about mothers caring for children, families caring for older people. Any kind of care work is usually not paid, with the result that there's a lot of people out there who are doing very serious work, but who receive no income for it. And one of the ideas with basic income is you would start to pay people for that work. 6, improve health outcomes. This is another one that has been very strongly demonstrated both in the basic income experiments, but also with unconditional cash transfers more generally, where you just give people cash as part of a smaller program. People's physical health improves, people's mental health improves. There are a number of reasons why this is, but the evidence is very clear. We can talk about that if people have questions. And the last one is to prepare for an aging society. I suppose many of you will know that many societies, particularly in richer countries, are aging. So fewer people are being born and people are living longer. So gradually the average age is moving towards an older stretch. Older people obviously have more health problems. Older people obviously work less or want to work less or should work less. And the idea is that basic income can help to smooth out the struggles that an aging society potentially will face. So there's quite a lot of possibilities there that universal basic income could address. And the question in an experiment is, well, which of these are you going to test for? Because you can't test for all of them. You have to select which ones you look at. So the first question is, well, why try universal basic income in Serbia, all right? And the really obvious answer is Serbia has a huge range of challenges facing it. And one of the biggest in the country is poverty. So Serbia has one of the highest rates of poverty risk in Europe. In terms of the gross domestic product of Serbia, we're a middle-income country, but only barely. Our gross domestic product is relatively high compared to many countries, but it's lower than Tunisia, it's lower than Ghana. There's lots of questions there over what's going to happen to Serbian economy in the longer term. That question of poverty, though, is very pressing. You can see from this map that there are areas of Serbia which have extremely high poverty risk rates. And there are, so far, there's been very little impact on those poverty levels. The policies that have been tried so far have not been particularly successful. So the question is, okay, maybe universal basic income could be a way of reducing poverty. So that's the starting point. Another reason for taking that as a starting point is, one, it fits into the Serbian government's policy. So Serbia has a poverty reduction policy. The government has signed up to it. It's a government document. And one of the things that you have to think about when you're designing a policy experiment is, will it fit into what the government wants? The reason being that you'll need to have government cooperation in order to actually design and implement an experiment. It's no use having a fantastic idea for a policy if the government is never, ever going to get behind it, or at least get out of the way. So what you want to do is to have something which the government can look at and say, yes, this fits in with our broader goals, and we're happy to cooperate in this. So poverty reduction is critical there, because the requirement is for something that's practical, but also something that's politically possible. The second point that we started with is, okay, well, there's been a lot of policy experiments in different countries around the world. So what can we learn from them? And this is a map from the middle of this year of the different pilot programs that have been either implemented or planned in different countries around the world. And you can see that there's a very large number of these policy experiments happening compared to even 10 years ago. There are actually some policy experiments that aren't on this map, that are now being discussed. Even in the last 2 months, 3 months, these new discussions have started. So it's a very exciting time in policy terms. You can also see that there's quite a variety of different countries on that map. So obviously most of it is concentrated in sort of some of the richer countries, the post-industrial countries. But you also see countries in the southern and eastern Africa. You see India and Iran and a couple of countries in the Middle East that are also looking at it. So there's a variety of different backgrounds here. For the research, we selected 6 countries and did in-depth analysis. My colleague did in-depth analysis, 3 of them in Europe, so Finland, the Netherlands, and Spain, and 3 of them outside of Europe, which was Iran, India, and Kenya. And the findings were really interesting. I'm not going to go into each of the countries because that would take too much time, but the headlines for the research. Firstly, true universal basic income has never really been tested. Each of these different experiments had at least one element missing from that formula of universal, basic, and income. Obviously, this is for practical reasons, and it's very unlikely that anybody will ever do a true UBI experiment, but it's worth looking at which elements were missing and how we might fill those in. The second thing was that each of the experiments was driven by a very different actor. So in the Netherlands and Spain, it was at the municipality level. At Finland and Iran, it was driven at the national level. And in Kenya and India, it was driven by specific donors. So non-governmental organizations that decided to implement it with the cooperation of the government. Now, obviously, each of those different actors have different motivations and different requirements, and that then defined the nature of the experiments. So they're very clearly driven by the organizers rather than from a grassroots level. So the organizers define what the parameters are, they design the experiments, and the results go at that high level. The existing experiment design also depended on the existing infrastructure of the country. And it's the infrastructure not in the physical sense, like roads or telephone networks, but infrastructure as the legal sense. So how is the social protection system organized? And the administrative sense, how is the government organized, and how can we interact with that? And one of the most interesting things is that in most of the cases, in fact, those experiment designs required that the legislation be changed in some way, especially where the experiment would interfere with the existing social protection schemes. So it's not a case that you can just do an experiment and everything will be easy. So in most cases, you actually have to change or work around the legislation in order to make it happen. So you can see already there's a lot of challenges to doing this sort of policy experiment. And I'm going to keep going on about that because it's, scary. There were also particular challenges about doing universal basic income pilots in Serbia. And again, I won't go into too much detail. I can share the experiment design with you, and hopefully the research will be fully published. I'll quickly go through these first. The type of welfare state and tax system that Serbia has actually makes it very difficult to do universal basic income. We can talk about what the Bismarck-style welfare state means and what scheduler taxation means, but trust me, it makes things difficult. Secondly, there's a large shadow economy. It's estimated that the illegal economy in Serbia is as much as 15% of the total GDP. So that's a lot of people who are outside the tax system and often outside the welfare system. And that would create a serious problem in terms of funding basic income and making sure that it was distributed on an equitable basis. Third, social expenditure in Serbia is already higher than any other European country except Slovenia. So already, if you're looking at basic income, taking the place of some of that social expenditure or supplementing it, that's going to be a huge burden on the national budget. Fourth, poor implementation could increase the relative poverty and not change income inequality. This isn't just in Serbia, but it's true in very specifically here, that if you do it badly, you could actually cause more problems than you solve. Lastly, the European trend in social welfare is towards more conditions rather than less. So governments are putting more conditions on receiving social protection and not removing those conditions. So the trend is away from what we would like to see in terms of basic income. There are also concerns from governments that if you give everybody a basic income, they won't want to work anymore. Now, the experiments that have been carried out show that this isn't true, but governments don't care about evidence when it comes to their ideological commitments. So there's definitely a discussion that needs to happen around that evidence and how we can actually transform that into policy statements. So this is a flow chart of different types of basic income experiments. It was prepared by a colleague of mine in the UK for the Royal Society there. And we frame this as an experiment because when it comes to working out what to do, how to fix problems that we have, how to address the wider structural problems of societies, you need to test, as I said. The only way to test is to carry out an experiment, and to do that you have to design a proper experiment. You remember that last point about poor implementation? If you design and implement an experiment badly, then you won't get the results you need, you won't get good results, and you'll discredit the entire policy. So you have to be very responsible when it comes to actually designing the experiment as well. So what we did is we had some funding from UNDP's regional office to commission the research here, from the Centre for Social Policy and from some economists, Serbian economists, and to then do the design. So the experiment that we propose has two parts. The first part is an actual basic income distribution to test the impact on labour market participation. So do people work more? Do people find more work, start more businesses, find it easier to get a job? On individual health outcomes, so does individual health, both physical and mental, improve if people are receiving a basic income? And on household financial well-being. So in a household which is receiving basic income, is there a generally better situation at the end of the experiment than at the start in terms of their household wealth? How much savings they have, whether they've been able to improve their house or other parts of their lives. So these three are the critical measures. The second part of the experiment is what's called a micro-simulation. This is a very common tool that economists use, where you basically set the parameters for what would happen if a basic income was implemented at a national level. And then you can run a simulation that tells you how much it would cost in terms of the taxation, and how much you would be able to pay out in terms of the income itself. And then you can play with the different parameters in the simulation and say, okay, well, if the basic income was 15,000 dinars, what would that cost for the budget? Okay, that's too much. What if it was 10,000 dinars? Well, how much would that cost? And you can work out, where the right balance is between the costs and the benefits. And if you put those two experiments together, you can build a broad picture of, okay, at a national level, what would the impacts be if we implemented universal basic income? So these two elements are both critical. This is a blank slide because I forgot to fill it in. The reason I forgot to fill it in is one of the questions that's come up is, obviously I mentioned that none of the experiments previously have tested universal basic income at a national level or universal basic income in its full sense. It's impossible by definition, unfortunately. So what we're proposing is that we would refer to this experiment as a modified basic income. It's not universal because it's not going to everybody, unfortunately, but it should be basic and it should be treated as income. So if we can work out a way of framing it so that we're honest about it, we're open about the limitations of the experiment, that also helps to have a more realistic policy discussion in the end. That people can't attack you for, because we already ran into the criticism, people were saying, oh, well, it's not universal basic income, it's not universal. It's like, well, we know it isn't, but what do you want, okay? If we relabel it as a modified basic income, we can actually focus on the real substance of the experiment and not just the label of the experiment. So, when we come to the actual experiment itself, what's the proposal? I'm not going to go into the detail of the experiment. I'm happy to share there's a two-page sheet which describes it in good detail. But it is quite detailed. The full experiment design is about 15, 16 pages long. But the overview is niche was selected as the site for a number of reasons, but the main one being the Opština in Niš is very interested in trying out new policies. They're very clear that things can't go on the way they are. Obviously, you know that Niš has really struggled with its economy and has struggled with its relationship with the central government. That it has very high levels of poverty in that area generally. But it has a lot of capability there. There's a lot of capacity in Niš and a lot of interest in pursuing this kind of experiment. The idea would be that we would select 1,000 individuals in Niš and another 1,000 as a control group. So the first 1,000 would be receiving a modified basic income for 2 years minimum, more if the funding was available, while the control group would not receive the basic income. So the idea with that, for those of you who have designed experiments before, the control group is to help you to test what the real impact is. Because you might deliver a basic income to these 1,000 people, but if Niš suddenly, the airport in Niš suddenly becomes this huge gold mine, and everybody in Niš suddenly gets an increased income because there are more jobs, the experiment is useless because you won't be able to separate out easily, okay, was it the basic income that helped these people, or was it Niš's economy becoming better? So the control group is a way of measuring that, because the control group tells you what happens to the same sort of people if they don't get the basic income. And then the last question, which is the one everybody wants to know, is what's the payment level? What's the income level? And what we decided is that probably it would set at roughly 15,500 dinars per month for a single person household. And remember, it's going to individuals, so it's to every individual. And the reason for setting it there is that's the relative poverty level, the last definition of the relative poverty level in Serbia. So depending on the budget for the experiment, we could go lower, probably wouldn't want to go higher. There are two reasons for selecting the relative poverty level. Obviously, one is you want to keep people out of poverty. That's one of the major points of the experiment. What happens when people no longer have the stress of being in poverty? The second reason is for the selection of the people themselves. You remember I mentioned that in many of the experiments, they had to temporarily change the legislation in order to implement the experiment. So one of the things we want to select is obviously people for the experiment. We want to select people who would benefit the most from receiving a basic income to see whether the impact is strong or not. But obviously, if you're at the poverty line, you might be eligible for social protection payments. And if you receive an additional income, you're not going to be eligible anymore. So if we were to give the income to somebody who would be eligible for social protection, we would be taking away that eligibility with no guarantee that the income would continue in the future. So what we want to do is to identify people who are close to that relative poverty level, but who weren't eligible for those social protection payments. And then from the control group, we would try to select people who were at a similar level, but turned out to be eligible for the social protection payments. So we would control against that. Now, this is very complicated. It could change if the experiment is implemented. It could change depending on discussions with the Ministry for Social Welfare, on discussions with the Opština Niš, on discussions with experts outside of Serbia who would help with the design, the final design. So that's not a guaranteed level, but that's the level that we proposed for the experiment. So we've got an experiment, we've got the research to back it up, we've got a municipality that's interested. What do we do next? Well, hopefully next we raise some money, we have more discussions like this, and we start to look at how we can implement it and when we can implement it. What we also have to do, though, is to be very clear about what basic income can and can't do. And so there are two lies that get told about basic income. There's more than that. But I think they characterize some of the discussion that we want to avoid. The first is that basic income is basically a money tree. That the idea is you just give people free money and everything's wonderful. And as you can tell from the presentation, it's not like that. This is an incredibly complicated issue, that even a small experiment of a few thousand people requires a huge amount of serious thought and careful design. At a national level, it's much, much more complicated and requires much more discussion. It's not just free money falling from trees. There's a lot that has to happen behind it. The second thing is, second lie is that basic income is just nobody works, everybody gets things for free. That's not the case. What we want to do is have a discussion about what the implications of basic income are, not just for the individuals that receive them, but for the country that implemented it. So in Serbia, what would our lives look like if universal basic income was implemented in every aspect? Basic income is not a magic bullet. One of the examples of basic income is called the Alaska Permanent Fund. It was set up after Alaska struck oil in the 1980s. And it basically guarantees everybody, every Alaskan citizen who's been resident for longer than 1 year, it guarantees them a basic payment every year. It's not enough to live on, but it's enough to help you considerably, particularly if you're poor. Nobody in Alaska has stopped working. Nobody has moved there to try and get this free money. They've designed it in a careful way. It's been very successful. It has huge support. The problem is that some governments, as they come in, want to destroy it. They want to get rid of it. There's still a huge debate around whether the Alaska Permanent Fund should even exist, let alone what the level should be. So it doesn't solve the political questions. There will still be political debate around these issues, and universal basic income is not a solution for that debate. It's also not clear how we get to universal basic income. So currently we have a particular type of system in Serbia for taxation, for social protection. And the question of how we get to universal basic income from where we are now is not clear at all. This is one of the things that we need to discuss. It's one of the things that the experiment can help with, but it's not something that the experiment can decide. So this is a very difficult struggle. I think I'll come to a couple of other political questions. The biggest one, and I know this concerns a lot of people, is that basic income has support both on the left and on the right. On the right, it tends to be supported by libertarians who see it as a way of getting rid of the state and just having the market deal with everybody's needs. So everybody gets an income, and then they just have to spend it in the market. So there is no guaranteed healthcare. You have to go to a hospital and pay for it. There is no guaranteed pension. You have to use your income basic income to cover it. There is no disability allowance. You have to use your basic income to cover it. So that's why it gets support on the right. It gets support on the right from people who want to get rid of the role of the state. The support on the left is more varied, but broadly, the people who I know who support basic income on the left don't just see it as replacing the role of the state or replacing social protection. They see it as a way of transforming the relationship between the citizen and the state, and also between the citizen and the market. The idea being that basic income can actually free us from wage slavery, if that's something you buy into. That essentially it gives us more flexibility in our personal lives, it gives us more freedom, more dignity, and the capacity to say no, so that people don't have to take jobs that they don't want just because they need to survive. And that in turn forces employers to automate in some cases, but also to start thinking about how they can attract and retain workers. It opens up incentives for other types of work organization. So, for example, I'm also involved in discussions about forming a cooperative. Anna's sitting at the back there. And one of the questions that cooperatives have is, well, how do you allocate resources within a cooperative? If you had a basic income, you could focus on the work of the cooperative rather than worrying all the time about how the resources within the cooperative are distributed. And that would encourage people to form that sort of arrangement more easily. At the very least, people on the left see basic income as the central pillar for a completely transformed social protection system. So that you have basic income as the foundation, and then other parts of the social protection system built onto it. So everyone gets the basic income, but people with disabilities get additional payments, children with special needs get additional payments, pensioners potentially gets additional payments. So it's not getting rid of social protection schemes, it's acting as a kind of a core for them that can't be taken away. Because as you know, one of the problems with social protection is, regardless of what type of social welfare it is, the government can change the policy, payments can go up and down, payments can be late. I mean, we see this in the case of pensions. Whereas a basic income, everyone would at least get that basic income every month regularly, and then the other parts of the social welfare system would be less of a stress, less of a pressure for people. So we have these questions. But of course, the biggest argument that we have to have over basic income is how do you pay for it? So this is a chart from The Economist that's based on an OECD report about basic income. And it looks at how to actually pay for basic income against tax. You can see here there's a range of countries. The detail's not that important. The point is we have to pay for it. We have to work out how to pay for it. We've gone through this question of whether basic income would act as a disincentive to work, that people would stop working if they had basic income. That's not true. I'll say that again. The evidence tells us that people will keep working even if they have a basic income. But you have to have the system set up so that the basic income can be taxed back in order to pay for to go into the budget. It's also true that basic income will be more expensive than most social welfare systems are at the moment. So in the countries here where you have social welfare systems, in countries like Serbia where social welfare is quite expensive, it will be more expensive to implement a basic income. It's no use trying to deny it. A lot of people try to wave it away. I don't think we should. I think we should accept it. But I think we should look at experiments to tell us, okay, what areas will we save in if we do basic income? So I'll give you an example. Basic income will cost more than social welfare. But it's also been shown in experiments that basic income makes people healthier. If people are healthier, that means there's less health expenditure. At the state level, there'll be less need to spend money on health, particularly for older people, particularly for people with special needs, because the basic income makes it easier for people to look after those needs before their situation gets worse. So, okay, it might cost you more as the basic income, but how much would we save over time in the health system? And as you know, the Serbian health system spends a huge amount of money. The pension system in Serbia spends a huge amount of money. The question is, how much would we save back in these other areas if, for example, it turns out that basic income does encourage people to start more businesses, it encourages economic activity, that means that there's more tax that can be collected, which means that it's easier to pay for. All of these questions have to be addressed. Again, it's very, very complicated. That's why we look at the micro simulations in the experiment to give us an idea of what that would look like. So, but paying for it, you can't dodge it. We have to talk about it. I think this is just a slide that I did, which is these are all the social protection programs in the city of Niš. In fact, in everywhere in Serbia, you can see there's quite a lot. I had no idea how complicated the social protection system was. These are all good, by the way. I like them all. I don't want to replace any of them really. the last thing to say is that this kind of policy experiment is the starting point. It's not the end point. So there's no point in doing an experiment if you're not following through afterwards. What we want to do is to create space for discussions, for policy discussions around not just basic income, but reform in general, reform in the tax system, reform in the social protection system, reform in the way that society is structured, the economy is structured. One of the things that I was interested in when we started doing this, we did a couple of consultation meetings in Belgrade with ministry staff, and obviously we had some discussions at the niche level. And I thought there would be more resistance to this. As you know, staff that work in the ministries, government employees, can be very conservative. They don't like anything that threatens their jobs. They don't like anything that would give them more work. I know how they feel. But the response was generally completely positive. The reason was that everybody in Serbia, including people who work in the government, recognize that the way that we structure things now can't go on, that it's not sustainable. The system we have now is not sustainable, that there needs to be change, that change is probably going to have to be radical, and that the only way of doing this is to try new things out. So I was very surprised, pleasantly surprised, that we had quite positive feedback on trying to do this kind of experiment from the government. So hopefully, as this moves forward, we'll be able to see whether that translates into support in practical terms on the ground. So that's the question. The final question is, how do we move forward? How do we actually implement an experiment in basic income in Serbia? I don't know how that's going to work. I don't know if it's going to work. I'm still part of this process of pushing it forward, but it's obviously going to take much longer than anybody hopes for. But this is a starting point for me to have a wider discussion about what it would take, what people think about it, how we collectively, and not just the government, not just the UN, how we collectively as citizens can actually move it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for this really, really insightful talk. Now, otvaramo za pitanja. Evo, ovde smo imali jedno pitanje i odmah onda vi samo dignite ruke i ja ću doći.
Hi, my name is Alexander. I was wondering, you were talking about that this is still in the experiment phase, and because I used to study economics, I remember we always talked about aggregate demand and how increase in demand also sometimes can turn into an increase of prices, and the real income actually doesn't really change, so that the increase in prices is just going to eat away all the increase in the income that people are going to have. Do you think that there is another policy that needs to be paired with the basic income in order to stop this from happening, or do you think that it wouldn't happen, it's unlikely that it's going to happen?
No, one of the concerns, so I didn't talk about this, because basic income has never been tried at a national level, it's very unclear what the macroeconomic effects of that policy would be. Some economists have argued that yes, you would basically see price inflation because unless you have a combination of policies. I think that may be true, not in every area of the economy, but in key areas. So, for example, if everyone's receiving a basic income, it might encourage landlords to increase the rent prices because they know people can afford it. And then that becomes a circle where rental incomes go up and it basically eats the basic income. You try to put the basic income up to cover the increasing rent prices and it becomes this horrible, horrible feedback loop. So it seems very likely that if you scaled basic income to a national level, yes, it would need to be accompanied by other policies. Once again, it's easy to make a caricature of basic income, and a lot of the critics of basic income do make that caricature. But everybody I've spoken to who's thought about this seriously, they all accept that other policies are going to be required, particularly at the macroeconomic level, in order to control the consequences of a basic income policy. It's not just going to be about price controls or subsidies, which are some of the ways that people have suggested. But you remember I mentioned many people see basic income as potentially being about a transformation of the relationship of the individual to the state and to the market. We can't foresee what that transformation will look like, and therefore there may be policy measures that we've not thought of before that we might need to implement. And again, I don't want to sort of go too deeply into that, because then, as you know, it goes into very difficult areas. But one of the reasons for running the micro simulations is to see exactly that. Because in a micro simulation, as you build up the simulation, you can test those different parameters. So what would happen if the costs of healthcare went up, for example? What would happen if rental costs went up? And you can play with that and see what it looks like. So it's possible to model it, but we can't work out what the policies are until we get a bit further along.
Hi, my name is Miroslav Ružica, sociologist and a former professor of social policy at the Indiana University. I will ask you to clarify this project. As I understood, if I understood you, so it is a formal project supported by our Ministry of Welfare?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. And you have decided about the city in which you are going to make this experiment?
Sort of.
Okay. So, okay, that is why I'm asking this question. So I'm pretty visible in this community because I was a former professor of social policy, and I haven't noticed any activity of this type.
Yeah.
And this is what puzzles me, and I would suggest why. In order to get any chance to experiment, it is not enough to get support from the government or UNDP. You need to go around a little bit, and not only civil society groups, but also these professional groups, especially in niche. And there are some people who can help you to find proper colleagues and proper institutions over there. Why I'm telling you that? Because our government is not what you saw or what you think that you understood. So it doesn't care about social welfare, any of the programs. It doesn't care about local people at all. So it is pretty liberal. And whatever has been done in the last 5 years was a completely pro-liberal decisions. So you will get a lip service. So they will support you. They will give you some kind of verbal or maybe even material support, but nothing will happen. So you need to get support from other groups in order to do something. And of course, experiment. You need to have several groups who would monitor and support the project. I was working for the World Bank, so I know the idea of monitoring and supporting and being surrounded by some people who are interested and ready to support some initiatives. So without that, I cannot see that you can succeed, in spite of support, verbal, from the government or UNDP program. And then some technical aspects. You are speaking about two groups, one control group and another not experimental group. And you mentioned, speaking about this control group, that, or not control group, that it could be based on these social welfare recipients. I am not sure that it's a good idea, and I will try to explain why. Based on inertia for the last 50 years. In this group, you will find people older than myself, without any working experience, so people who are living on the edge of society, and you are not going to learn anything from them, and they are not going to benefit. So you need to think about some similar groups, but not that one. Because they are, how will you say, in lefty groups, they are out, I forgot now the term, declassed people without any awareness of their position. And in this very context, I think that you need to consult or to have partners in these social institutions called Center for Social Welfare, it is extremely conservative institution, and without any idea of initiatives and any idea of doing something, but without them you are not going to support. So I apologize for being so long, but
that's okay.
I have some ideas also. And I think that you have forgot, okay, my key suggestion, or even criticism would be, in order to develop this idea, I think you need to activate our professional and academic groups. Mm-hmm. Without them, it's very difficult. And then to add some arguments you didn't mention today because of probably a very limited space and time. It is why it may be very important in 5 to 10 year period. Why IVA? No, sorry. We have different shortcut. Why? It is technological reasons and something that you know, and people here probably know. It is precariat or precarity. You know? Yeah. The work is not going to be a base for any pension system very soon. And it is not sure what is going to be base for any of social benefits. And people from academia may understand that and may support it and may become interested. Yeah. Sorry.
That's again, okay.
Thank you.
I will try to respond. I am well aware of the position of the government. I am also being recorded on video. So I have no illusions about the situation in Serbia. Neither did anybody who was involved in the project. I would say that UNDP has already been carrying out some policy experiments with different opštinas, including niche. So there is a responsive element in the government. It's just difficult to identify. Most of the other elements that you mentioned are in the experiment design. So it talks about activating professional groups. It talks about building more grassroots support. It talks about specifically how and why the experimental selection was made and how the control group was made. There are particular reasons for it, both political and practical. So I think the full experiment design would answer some of your questions. And the research itself obviously talks a bit more. The research documents talk about the whys, you know, the precariat in particular, automation, all of these issues. I wasn't able, as you said, I wasn't able to go into them, but I'd be very interested to continue this discussion and talk about, well, within the sociology and other academic professions, who are good people to talk to, where would be the interesting places to take the discussion further. But all of the points you raise are completely accurate. I think you're absolutely right on all of them. And it makes me feel quite good because I realized that we covered a number of those points in the experiment, in the research. So that validates the design to some extent. But these questions are not settled. As you said, you haven't heard anything about it. One of the reasons I'm doing this talk and a couple of other talks is because nothing has happened since we finalized the experiment design. We know that there are parts of the government that have now started to raise the question of basic income. There have been a couple of articles in some of the newspapers, but we have not taken the discussion out into the professional communities, into the general public, into the government, and that's what needs to happen. It's not so much about raising money, it's more about having these discussions and seeing whether that support makes sense. So yeah, hopefully this is just the start.
So, should I repeat everything from the beginning? Or? No, okay, thanks. But so, on the other hand, if we're talking about an experiment that should tell us what would be the effects of the policy, and of course it has the limitations of the scope and length, sure, I mean, you're taking a sample of 1,000 people and inferring what could be the effect on the population, and we have no idea. That's why we're doing microsimulation and so on. And the other thing is the length, right? 2 years is something that makes me concerned in a way, of course, because it depends on funding. But I guess what you want to show, or ideally what we want to know, are the long-term incentives, systems of incentives that people will have. That's what the policymakers are concerned about, whether we will all become like lazy asses, like sitting on a couch all day, or whether it will actually change our attitude towards work. And I guess there is no way that you can show this in an experiment. I mean, the long-term behavioral changes that it will create. So, is there anything that you have seen being done that did take these long-term effects in mind? So let's ignore the scope and let's just talk about length. And let me just add, I don't mean the Alaska thing, because clearly, like what we have here, universal basic income has an overlap area with both unconditional cash transfers and the sovereign fund. Yeah. Which basically, I mean, in both cases, it's not really a big deal, right? We have this pile of money and we just, you know, make a deal whether we'll have a dividend each year or not. I mean, we're blessed anyhow with this resource. Yeah. And in the other hand, I mean, we're not really being blessed. It's like a deal, a way to deal with poverty, where universal cash transfers, unconditional cash transfers are really a choice whether we will make projects like and spend money on managing projects or just give like cash handouts as a development aid. Yeah. So here, the middle area, is just the choices are much more difficult, I guess, and the way that you explained it, it has supporters of both left and right. I mean, it makes sense to me because I could see how clearly, you know, right-wing, you know, politicians could see this as a good thing because basically, as you said, the trend is more conditions, not less. Well, let's just drop all these conditions and just give them this, and we don't have to spend any money on this. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the long-term effects, as you mentioned, like health, I guess it would make sense, but I don't see a way that you can show this in an experiment, of course. And on the other hand, if you could just comment more on these left-right issues and where is the overlap? And as you said, you're personally against replacing one for the other. And you might be for just adding. But if you would have to make a compromise, like where would you strike the line? Like what could be replaced and what could remain if you would introduce UB in Serbia?
Okay. So first, we should clarify some of the terms that you used. So I've described universal basic income as a social policy. There is an overlap with unconditional cash transfers, UCTs. So unconditional cash transfers are a welfare tool usually used for poverty reduction, which have been tried in a number of countries, including Brazil, where poor people get money. So it's different from basic income, because basic income means everyone gets money. But the experiment that we're doing is very much unconditional cash transfers in order to simulate what a basic income would look like. Sovereign wealth fund as well, worth clarifying. A few countries that have got natural resource wealth, so Alaska, for example, I mentioned Norway also has it, established what's called a sovereign wealth fund, where the country basically reinvests the money on behalf of the citizens and then pays it out again in different forms. Obviously, Serbia doesn't have oil, so we're very unlikely to have a sovereign wealth fund. If any of you have got homes in the village, just go out into the garden and start digging. If you find any oil, let me know. Can solve the problem there. The duration of the experiment. I specified a minimum of 2 years because I thought, so that cost for what we designed would be about 3.2 million for just the payments, not for the administration, which is okay. It sounds like a lot, but frankly, you know, in global economic terms, it's not a lot. The ideal would obviously be to keep that experiment going as long as possible. There are no long-term basic income experiments mature yet. There's the experiment in Kenya, which Give Directly are doing, and they've committed to 10 years payments to people in rural Kenya. It's very early, but we'll see what happens with that one. However, in most of the basic income experiments that I have seen, the impacts are often visible as early as 6 months in. So, for example, with there was recently, it's ongoing, but an experiment in Finland, which was designed to help people get back into work. So they're not measuring everything. They're mainly measuring people's labor market participation. But some of the informal results from that, already in 6 months, people reported increased well-being. They felt better about their lives generally, the people who were on basic income. So, you know, some of those sorts of dignity and health-related impacts can be seen relatively quickly. The question of whether they're long-lasting or what the long-lasting impact is, we don't know. So it is a question. In terms of how I see, you know, what would I trade off? What would I trade on this table for universal basic income? It's not up to me to answer that question. And I know that's a very bad excuse, but it's real. I'm never going to set myself up as the dictator who makes the decisions about what stays and what goes. What I will say is that I'm one of the people who thinks that basic income should be seen as a transformative policy. I think it's absolutely essential, absolutely necessary that we restructure our entire society, our entire economy, not just make small changes, not just make small reforms, but actually genuinely change it. And I see basic income potentially as being a pillar, a foundation for doing that. I'm not committed to basic income. I want to explore this. I'd like to see more experiments, but I want to see it because I think this broader change needs to happen. And I think with these sorts of experiments, we can start to build up the evidence to argue for that broader change. So, yeah, I don't have any specific things that I'd kick off here. No, I like them all. I don't know what a child personal attendant is. That was never clear to me on this. So maybe that can go. Maybe they can do something else instead. Sorry, I wish I had a better answer for you on that one. Any other questions or thoughts?
Hi, I'm Peja. Thanks for this nice presentation. Actually, I want to reflect on this last slide, and I would not agree with this post-ideological slide. I think basic income can be really left or right, and for me it's interesting this political potential of basic income, because in the last few years most of these basic income experiments were implemented by conservative right-wing governments. You already mentioned this Finland basic income experiment, which is biggest right now ongoing experiment, and it's implemented by right-wing government, and the only thing which they measure is employability of people. They are not measuring this well-being or health cost or other things, and I'm afraid of that right-wing more and more taking over this basic income concept. And one concrete question in this your account for how much money you want to give to people in niche, like you mentioned 15,500 dinars. Did you count also some kind of household costs and rent of households in this 15,000, or it's not?
So first, I agree with you. The post-ideological slide, I just needed to fill a slide. I don't like it. I recognize that we are not in a post-ideological age, and we have to work in the system we've got, which is still very much a contest, not just between left and right, but between progressive and conservative, between, you know, there's different axes, between authoritarian and libertarian. We have to work in the real context. So I accept that criticism. I'll never use that slide again. No, so as I mentioned, the 15,500 dinars is the relative poverty level. It's the level the government has set, and it's the government that set it, that they estimate is enough to keep people out of poverty on a monthly basis. So it builds in the living costs, the basic living costs, being able to cover your shelter, your food, pay the basic bills. That's all it does. Now, anybody who's studied economics will know that that is a completely made-up number. I mean, it's not made up from nothing, but it is just somebody sitting there and calculating things and then working it out. But the reality is, if you're talking about having to work in the actual, you have to identify a specific number. You have to identify a specific amount that you would pay out as income and then work with it. We could spend a huge amount of time just trying to calculate what a basic income should be. But in the end, when you're designing the experiment, you have to put a budget together. And so I looked at that number and I thought, that works for almost everybody. There's problems with it. But in terms of building an experiment, building a budget for it, and being able to take it to the government or to a donor, or then people can live with that. Because, and this is where it gets politically important, whenever anybody asks me or anybody else, why did you pick that number? You have to have a good reason. It can't be because I like it. It can't be because that's how much my uncle needs to live on. You have to be able to defend it from a policy point of view. And so in the end, that plays a part in this formulation as well. So I don't necessarily think it's the best number, but it's the number that I can defend most easily when I have to. And it's also the number that I think is probably closest to bringing people out of poverty. The worst case scenario, right? Let's say we did this experiment. It's only 2 years and it's only 15,500 dinars and it's only 1,000 people. The worst case scenario is, at the end of 2 years, 1,000 people didn't have to live with the stress and lack of dignity and general terribleness of living in poverty for 2 years. And I'm okay with that. And this is, hopefully we'll edit this out. Even if the experiment's a massive failure, if we've managed to help 1,000 people with a bit of extra income for 2 years, then it's not a complete failure because it helped 1,000 people in the end. Obviously, I don't think it's going to be a failure, but, worst case scenario, people are out of poverty. Yeah, that wasn't as convincing as I thought when I first chose that number. I have to work on that.
Sorry. Hi. Just one more general question, I guess, and I think it is maybe also a way to answer, is it experiment can be fair or not, is you talked about basic income being transformative in order to change the relationship between the individuals and state and the market. But in what sense? What is the end game in that matter, and what would be the ideal transformation? Not just like empty slogan, but what which. What is the way forward in that sense?
Yeah, and again, I don't want to be the dictator who says what the end state is, right? It's a discussion that everybody has to be part of, including people who disagree with it. So one of the most interesting books for me over the last few years has been a book called Inventing the Future, which has basic income as one of the key sort of policy recommendations. But it's a left accelerationist view of a series of social and economic transformations that could lead to the sort of transformed society that I would like to live in. So I'd recommend it if you can get hold of a copy. It's a good book. It's very well written. I don't think it's been translated into Serbian. I can do that as part of my Serbian language learning. But if you ask me, what is it about this transformative aspect that I want to see going forward? At the very least, what I want to see the people whose labour has been unpaid getting income and not having to worry about it. So, for example, my mother looked after my grandparents as they were getting older and as they were moving towards death. And she did it for free, and she had no expectations. And if you'd said, I'll pay you for it, she would have said no, because that's not why she did it. But the reality is, she did a lot of work that if you employed a nurse to do, would have cost a lot of money. And I think in terms of people's dignity and in terms of what people deserve, I used the word deserve at the start, people deserve to have something for that. People deserve to be able to say with dignity that they can give their time to it and not feel they're giving something else up. and not feel that it's not valued. People who are creative, for example, there's a struggle for all of you who write or make music or make art. It's impossible to make a living in Serbia doing that unless you're very lucky. And yet we need art, we need creativity, we need culture. So basic income can offer people who want to spend their time on creative stuff an income that will allow them to live while they pursue that. And that might seem trivial, but that's only trivial if you think culture is trivial. And I don't think culture is trivial. So it's transformative in those sorts of senses. And it's transformative in the sense I think I mentioned, which is at the moment, people have to take jobs which give them terrible conditions and terrible pay because they need to feed their families or pay for their basics. And what that means is as we live in the precariat, people are less able to organize themselves collectively to argue for better conditions. Right? So we're living in an age in which union strength is being diminished all across the post-industrial world, and yet what's replacing it in the precariat doesn't offer that sort of collective bargaining. And so there's no chance of people arguing for better working conditions. A basic income enables someone, both individually but also collectively, to argue for better working conditions. Because if you don't need to work, they have to offer you something else. They have to offer you dignity, or they have to offer you benefits, or they have to offer you a sense that you're actually contributing to something rather than just being a cog in a machine. People want to work, and I know this is we can have an argument about this from a sort of political view. I think people want to work, not in the sense that they want to get a salary, but in the sense that they want to contribute meaningfully to their society. And that's both the sort of work that we currently value in terms of running a business, and also the sort of work that we don't currently value in terms of looking after families and doing creative acts. People want to contribute meaningfully. And the transformation I would like to see from basic income is that all of those contributions are recognized and people don't have to struggle in jobs that are frankly terrible in order to get through life. That's very utopian. But hopefully from this, you recognize I'm a realistic utopian. I don't think this is something that happens tomorrow. I don't think it's something that's easy. I don't think it's something that necessarily we'll ever get to. But that's a future that I would like to work towards. How are we for time?
We have another 20 minutes.
Cool.
Somebody.
Does anyone have any other questions or follow-up?
Not really a follow-up. So a new question, really. So how do you, can you explain us how do you think people that will be given these handouts in the program, in the experiment, will see this? I mean, when you put yourself in their shoes, what do you think an average person in this cohort of 1,000 people, how do you see them thinking about this? And also, how do they communicate this with their, surroundings, with their neighbors? How do they present this?
Yeah. So,
do they need to know about the concept, or are they going to know that they are going to be an experiment or so? How did you?
Yeah. So in the experiment design, it's very clear there has to be a huge amount of awareness raising around this, both for the people who are receiving the basic income and for their neighborhoods, for their broader community. You can't just suddenly start dropping money in and expect to have a useful experiment. So an example, the best example is the way that Give Directly have done their experiment in Kenya. They've selected entire villages. So they have they've made it easy for themselves because they don't have to necessarily worry about conflicts within villages. They do have to worry about conflicts between villages, but they take a lot of effort to educate people about what's happening, to make it clear what's happening, and to make it a choice. So some people who are offered it turn it down because they think there's a trick involved. And that's a reasonable thing to think. But their wishes are respected. They don't receive it. They might regret it later, but this is part of the process. They also, within the program, they have regular visits to the communities where they're working. They try to identify if there are conflicts coming up, and they try to work with the community to minimize those conflicts. The reality is that there are always going to be those sorts of dynamics where somebody is receiving something that somebody else is not. It is going to be difficult to explain to people why it's an experiment and what that means. but we have to do it. Part of the design, the recommendations from the design, are to work very closely with people on the ground, with professional communities, with the media, to do that education piece and to continue to do it all the way through the program. There's also the aspect of how you learn from it, and learning becomes part of that interaction. The approach that I've recommended is called Diaries of the Poor, which some people may have heard of. It's basically where you ask people who are participating in the experiment to keep a journal for their household in which they record what they're doing financially. So it's a private journal. They don't show it to anybody else except to the monitoring teams who come and visit them on a regular basis, normally on a month or 2 monthly basis. So someone comes in and sits down and just goes through the journal with them and says, so why have you changed this? And those journals enable you to identify how spending patterns have changed. But they're also a very good way of making sure that people understand what's going on, of emphasizing, okay, this journal will be kept for 2 years, so that's how long you'll have to, and that will help people to sort of focus in on, yes, this will last for 2 years, and I have to think about it in those terms. So those teams visiting also become part of that education piece. It is a difficult piece. I don't know how people will react. I've never been a poor person in niche. I've never been this kind of declassed citizen who frankly has been marginalized from society. People may react in unexpected ways. Again, if we look at the experiments, whether that's in India, Namibia, Finland, Canada, we do see similar things happening regardless of the class status of the people, regardless of the gender or the balance. We see people having a sense of dignity restored. And that's one of the things that I think often gets missed when people look at the experimental findings, is that people feel a sense of value in their lives that they didn't before. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see if that can happen in Serbia, because I know that one of the things that one of the real problems that we have here is that a lot of people have given up. They've been marginalized by the system, or they've been cut out of the economy. They've lost their job and there are no more jobs for them. They've never been able to complete their education, and they can't see a way forward. There's a lot of people, particularly especially outside of Belgrade, who are in that situation. It'll be really interesting if we do get this experiment off the ground, simply in terms of seeing whether that makes a change. Because even if we never get to universal basic income, that sort of evidence shows us that there is a way of dealing with people which is better for the people themselves. And I recognize that there are, let's say, elements within the government or dynamics within the government that don't really care. But there are people who do care, both in the government and outside the government. And for those people that do care, that kind of response, the finding that people's lives can have more dignity, I think should give us all hope, should give us all the energy to take things forward, even if it's not basic income, even if it's other policies, even if it's just having discussions on a different basis. Those kind of experiment findings can give us all, I think, more energy to take it forward. So.
Hello everyone, my name is Eva. Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you for adopting this critique about the last slide. I hope we will never see it again as well. Okay, so sorry to continue in this kind of skeptical note maybe, but first question would be, how would you, I mean not you, but how do you see that there is any guarantee, if you said that their pensions are late, that they're decreasing the amounts and this kind of insecurity about any kind of social benefits, so how do you see that this will be a guarantee? I mean, how would we implement, any kind of measure to prevent this? First question, and then the second one is to go maybe in line with the last thing that you were saying. I mean, of course, the money is something that gives you back your dignity. I mean, when you're poor, that definitely. But there is also, how would you bypass in the results this kind of, and I'm thinking about the example in Kenya that you're mentioning. There's also a sense of dignity when someone approaches to you and says, you're important, you're part of this experimental group. And I'm saying that I can easily imagine people from niche, I know many of them, having this positive reaction that is quite, not like objective one, like we are now feeling more important because we can afford, milk every day instead of once a week. But it's more like I feel important because I'm aware while I'm in this experiment that I matter to someone a little bit more, and someone who may be gone in 2 years, but I matter. And how do you bypass this, or I don't know.
So actually that's an effect I hadn't thought of before, that just being selected for the experiment might make somebody feel more valued. But it's true, they might. I guess that the only way to check for that would be during the monitoring, is to include as part of the monitoring, a little bit of directing the questions towards why people are feeling better. So exploring that. So that's something I think that worth thinking about for me. Thank you. How do you protect it? Yeah, if pensions can be cut, then why can't basic income be cut? Yeah. In the end, the way we currently structure our state systems, the taxation and the expenditure of the state, it's a continual struggle to balance the two. It's a continual struggle to protect the things that are important and to work out how to get the balance right. Yeah. Part of the transformative aspect, if I was being utopian, the transformative aspect would be that this is simply something that people would accept, something that people would just have internalized so much. The idea of taking it away is out of the question. An example of that would be the national health system in the UK. You cannot attack the national health system directly in the UK. You can't do it. No one will listen to you. It has such wide support, such deep support. It's part of the national identity to the extent that it was celebrated I don't know if you saw the opening of the UK Olympics. The National Health Service was, celebrated as part of that. You can attack it indirectly, which is what conservative governments do. They restructure it, they cut the relative funding, they throttle back on key aspects like training of medical staff and paying your own medical staff. So there are ways of attacking institutions even when they're very, very central to the identity of the country. And that's where we come in. There is no way to guarantee. If a dictator comes in and decides to unilaterally destroy the entire thing, yeah, that can happen. It's not going to happen in Serbia. We'll never have a dictator here. But part of the work of transformation is to embed the idea, is to embed the value of it so deeply in a society that it's almost impossible to attack it, and then to defend it. The way that you defend the National Health Service is not by celebrating it at the Olympics, it's by defending it. It's by writing letters, it's by lobbying MPs, it's by the professional groups making their voices heard. It's all of these aspects of society. And as I said, the Alaska Permanent Fund shows that these things never go away. The act of building your society never finishes. And that might be depressing, but it's also what makes it a society. It's the fact that you hand it over from generation to generation, this struggle to define what's important, what's valuable, what we do. So yeah, I don't have a magic solution for that because there is no magic solution. It's a continual process of negotiation and renewal and undermining and recombining and all the things that make a society develop. So look forward to that. Yay.
My name is Miloš. My question is, how big will be income of recipients of universal basic income in your experiment before receiving universal basic income, and how will be exactly income big of control group?
So, the answer to that question is, I don't care. Because part of the experiment is it's unconditional. What we don't, so the only identifying characteristic of both the recipients and the control group is that they're at similar economic levels, which is roughly at the relative poverty line. We identify them through the centers of social welfare, through basically the eligibility roles and the rejection roles. And we've spoken briefly to the centers, and they are prepared to consider this. So it should be possible to do. It might be more difficult than we think it is, but that's still the best way to approach it. But beyond that, yeah, we know that they're roughly at the poverty level. I don't want to know what their income is, because the point of the basic income is that you don't apply any conditions. And as soon as we start applying conditions, we undermine the validity of the experiment. So I don't care what the actual income people are receiving are, who are receiving the basic income, and I don't care what the actual income is of the people who are in the control group. The other reason for that is that, you remember I mentioned that there's a huge shadow economy in Serbia, illegal economy, 15% of the GDP. People in the control group and in the basic income group will probably be participating in that illegal economy in one way or another. We don't want people to not participate because they think they might lose out on that income as well. We want people to have their normal lives as they were before, but then what happens if you give them this basic income? For example, it might be very interesting if we see some evidence, circumstantial evidence, that people feel able to move out of the shadow economy by forming their business legally. Right? So if you've got the basic income, and let's say we manage to extend it for 5 years, somebody who's running a small business might go, well, at the moment, you know, I've got this garage, but I can't invest in the garage because, you know, if I invest in it, then it'll become obvious, then I'll have to start paying the police or the tax office. So I'm not going to make it a formal business, and therefore I can't get a loan or I can't buy equipment, etc., etc. But if they get a basic income, right, okay, I've got a basic income, I'm not going to lose out. Maybe I should think about what would happen if I did form it as a proper business, and you know, I can improve it. And so I don't know. I don't know, but it might be an interesting effect to look at. So the answer is we shouldn't worry about that, but in the course of the experiment, we should keep an eye on that to see whether there's any impact on people's household incomes. I would expect to see people's household incomes going up. Not everybody's, but a significant proportion of the people receiving basic income. I think there will be a multiplier effect from finishing education, from entering the labor market or starting a business, simply from the multiplier effect. So for example, here's a health example. Many people in poverty don't go and seek medical help because it'll be expensive. And so their medical conditions get worse. And the medical conditions stop them from working, or stop them from working as hard. If you have a basic income, you won't be so uncomfortable about getting help for your medical condition because you know you've got the basic income to rely on. You will be able to buy the treatment that you might not have been able to afford otherwise, and therefore be able to work more, and therefore your income overall might go up. So those are the sort of effects that I was mentioning we want to measure for. I don't know how widespread those effects will be, but in other experiments they have been seen. That people, their physical health goes up because they are more able to seek help, they seek help earlier, and they can afford to maintain the treatment for that help over a longer period of time. So, you know, we just don't know.
But I understood that you compare universal basic income with social welfare, which will people from control group have, and people from a group of recipients want.
Mm-hmm. That's right. But one of the things you're looking at is the unconditionality. So anyone who's receiving the social protection right, it's being given on a certain basis. It's not an income. It's a welfare payment. And part of the education piece is explaining to people that what you're getting, we're classifying it as an income, and working with the municipality to make sure that's communicated clearly and that it's treated as income. So what you're seeing there is a different basis for the money that people are getting. The other thing is that the income is going to be guaranteed, whereas a number of the social protection payments are means tested, and so they're not guaranteed over that 2-year period. Now, a number of those, let's go back to that slide, which is something that I think people can accept. Everyone can accept this, right? Everyone's happy with that. It's not post-ideological. So many of these are guaranteed, not guaranteed, but many of these are not means tested, but some of them are. So you have to demonstrate that you're poor enough to deserve this particular type of payment. The basic income, you never have to prove anything. So you'll have enough that you'll be out of poverty, but you'll never have to prove anything about whether you deserve it or not. And that's kind of a critical part of the experiment from a policy point of view, but also from a practical point of view of measuring the way people respond to it as an economic incentive. Frankly, before we actually implement the experiment, we will have to dig a lot more into these programs and work out, what the sort of the profile of the experiment participants are going to be in terms of what they receive. So yeah, this is not the end of the question, and the point you've raised is still a live point. It's not settled. So I don't have a clear answer for you, is what I'm saying. I've just spent 5 minutes not clarifying.
Thank you. Yeah,
we had another question.
We'll have one last question.
One last question.
Okay, I have a lot of things in my head, and I don't speak that well English, so okay. I will try to explain myself. Marx says that in capitalism everything goes to abstraction, and in the economic financial area this is more hardcore. Like money and real economy, this relationship is broken. So why give money and don't give basic things to live, like home, food, more?
Yeah, so it's a good question. As I said, there are people who are now proposing other ideas, like universal basic services. There's a couple of people that have proposed the idea of universal basic mobility, which is basically that all transport should be paid for by the government, because there's a very clear multiplier effect on transport, both for individuals as individuals, but also as working in the market. So it's not the only way. There are other ways, there are other things that we could explore as policies. As I said, I'm not married to universal basic income. I think it's a leverage point that we can press in the system to see what discussions we could have, what changes we could make. Some people have proposed that in the future we have two types of money: people money and robot money. And robot money is the abstract money that you're talking about. Now, obviously, a machine has no requirements for the basics that we do. But in the finance system that we have, it's essentially a lot of machines trading with each other, and it's going in that direction. So in the financial markets now, it's mainly machines trading with other machines, and then a few people buying a share here and there. So it has reached that level, and it's going to keep going in that direction. That's machine money, essentially. It's the money that the global machine of industry would need to pay itself. And then people money becomes the money that we need to exchange on a day-to-day basis. And basic income could be part of that, but other people have proposed other types of money systems. That we could have money systems that don't fulfill every single definition of money. Time banks, for example, where people trade their time for each other rather than paying each other. So you give me a guitar lesson for an hour, and I mow your lawn for an hour, and that we can exchange on that basis. And the reason then for having basic income is because, well, that's all very good, but I can't eat your cuttings from your lawn, so I would still need money to be able to buy food, commodity things. You might be able to set up systems where people could barter, but frankly, going back to a barter system is not good. The reason one of the reasons why money is superior to barter is because it's much more flexible and it creates much more possibilities. So some form of money is probably inevitable. If we didn't have it, people would just create it again. But we can have different types of money. We can potentially design monies for our community. And that's actually how I came to basic income in the first place. I was looking at how different types of money might be implemented. But yeah, these are much wider questions, and that's part of the transformative aspect. The transformation is not just about ending people being trapped in jobs. It's also about redefining the commercial relationships between people and what that means for us and how we implement that. So I agree with everyone. Wonderful.
Okay, thank you, Paul, for really being exposed to all this discussion, and hvala svima što ste učestvovali u ovom razgovoru. Nadam se da ovo nije nikakav kraj diskusije na ovu temu. Nažalost, mi sad u ovom trenutku moramo bar ovaj formalni deo da završimo. Vidimo se 24. na sledećem razgovoru. Doći će nam Ana Mendez iz Madrida. A do tada vas molim da pogledate i pokupite publikacije koje su tu na samom izlazu. I hvala vam još jednom puno. And thank you, Paul, so much.